Hi, and welcome to another episode of About the Authors TV. I'm your host, Jake Brown. The New York Times recently quipped that it's hard to imagine one of David Baldacci's fans looking up from one of his books' breathy sentences to ask themselves what compels him to face the blank page every day, especially given that, as USA Today has reported on for decades now, Baldacci is no stranger to the bestsellers list, with People magazine acknowledging him as a master storyteller, and some correctly calling him the king of the Beltway thriller. The Daily Beast would spotlight how naturally that talent arrived fully formed with his very first career-making bestseller, Absolute Power, noting that in his best-selling thrillers, Baldacci often predicts real-life threats before they hit the news. His first novel became a Clint Eastwood movie, and in the many books he's written since, he combines action, intrigue, and inside the Beltway dealings. His books are virtually an international industry, with some 150 million in print. The Associated Press has crowned him a master craftsman, adding that Baldacci does an excellent job of setting the scene and creating complex characters in a gripping page-turner, spotlighting one of his most popular characters, John Puller, as one of the most compelling in David Baldacci's thrillers. Puller is a crackerjack investigator of military crimes. Twists and turns come fast and furious in the best Baldacci tradition, as they sure did over the course of Zero Day, The Forgotten, The Escape in No Man's Land, which the military press found has a plausible theme with a compelling and action-packed plot, a riveting and heart-wrenching story, an edge-of-your-seat thriller. Readers will be hooked from page one. The Huffington Post declared as his catalog grew into the tens of millions of copies sold around the world to a loyal and rapidly growing fan base that David is one of America's favorite mystery writers, and he's earned that adulation fair and square. He is constantly turning out one readable and enjoyable adventure after another, and whether spotlighting the Camel Club series, which Booklist concluded was a rousing success over the course of the self-titled debut, The Collectors, Stone Cold, Divine Justice, and Hell's Corner, where they specifically celebrated the fact that Baldacci shows once again that he is a sort of thriller renaissance man, a master of plot, dialogue, and character. His hometown paper, the Richmond Times-Dispatch, would write of his duology, starring A. Shaw and Katie James, over the course of The Whole Truth and Deliver Us from Evil, that it was equal parts Hitchcock and James Bond. It's the perfect literary cocktail, one of Baldacci's best. While readers were just as excited for the team-up of Sean King and Michelle Maxwell, where the New York Daily News found that they're fictional treats, a fabulously entertaining team throughout Split Second, Our Game, Simple Genius, First Family, The Sixth Man, and King and Maxwell. Will Roby would step into the solo spotlight to dish out justice to those beyond its legal reach, starting in The Innocent, where Suspense magazine concluded that this book is definitely a one-day, edge-of-your-chair read, with an ending that is a complete surprise. One of the best Baldacci since Absolute Power, this is one that will have all suspense readers enthralled. The hit, The Target, in which Kirkus Reviews was swept away by a no-holds-barred tale of perfidy and murder at the highest level. Baldacci's prose crackles with urgency. Roby and Real fans will thrill to see their favorite spies back in action. The Guilty and the series capper Endgame, where the Real book spy found that, as usual, it was hitting on all cylinders from beginning to the end. Baldacci brings back his best character with a bang. Detective Amos Decker was next on the case, starring in his own series with Memory Man, where Crime Spree magazine found Baldacci has definitely hit a home run. Sequel, The Last Mile, where the New York Journal of Books was impressed with the way the author excels at developing interesting three-dimensional protagonists. Fans will not be disappointed. This book gives them good reason to look forward to the next Decker thriller. And The Fallen, where they found similarly that Amos Decker novels just keep getting better and better, along with sequels The Fix, Redemption, Walk the Wire, and Long Shadows most recently. But the hits didn't stop there. Wilderness-based FBI agent Atlee Pines took readers on a different sort of tale entirely down the long road to mercy, where Killer Nashville found that Baldacci weaves an intricate tale full of action, adventure, and intrigue. His latest page-turning thriller lives up to the reader's expectation and beyond. Sequel, A Minute to Midnight, Daylight, and Mercy most recently, where the Globe and Mail rave that it's just too good. There's more than one case to be solved in this complex mystery about a very interesting woman, one of Baldacci's best. Recently exonerated World War II soldier and prisoner Aloysius Archer met readers on the page for the first time in One Good Deed, where former President of the United States Bill Clinton crowned it one of his finest books. Sequel, A Gambling Man, with CNN promising that for historical crime fans, this one's got it all, and Dreamtown most recently. David displayed a different side of his talent with the YA series Freddy and the French Fries and Fries Alive, and The Mystery of Silas Frankelbein, and then the Vega Jane series, where Scholastic promised that this was David Baldacci as you've never seen him before, throughout The Finisher, The Keeper, The Width of the World, and The Stars Below. Film and television adaptations of his work have included the blockbuster Absolute Power, directed by and starring Clint Eastwood, along with Gene Hackman, Scott Glenn, Laura Linney, and Ed Harris, the King and Maxwell TV series, the film Wish You Well, while One Summer was also adapted to a film in 2021. Baldacci is equally celebrated for his standalone bestsellers like The Winner, where the New York Daily News raved that he hit the jackpot again, pushing the pace pedal to the floor and taking the turns on two wheels. The Simple Truth, Saving Faith, where the LA Times was instantly addicted, musing that one is compelled to keep reading. Wish You Well, with Publishers Weekly discovering that this novel has huge heart. Last Man Standing, The Christmas Train, which became a hit Hallmark film. True Blue, One Summer. The 620 Man, where Reader's Digest was blown away by the corporate conspiracies, corruption, and murder that all come together in one of thriller fans' most anticipated books of the summer. His experience in this genre truly shines as he builds complex layers of riveting twists and turns to keep you on the edge of your seat. And Simply Lies most recently, and he's here today to talk all about his staggering success in literature. David, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being with us. Turning the proverbial page back to years before you became a household name yourself, with your own shelves in people's home libraries, what sort of stories could fans have found you pulling off of your own family bookshelf and first reading or hearing as a kid?
I kind of sort of the trifecta. Both of my paternal and maternal grandmothers lived with us for the last 10 years of their lives. So they grew up in the late 1800s, one from Italy and one from Southwest Virginia. And I sort of learned storytelling from at their knee. They would tell me about their lives. We would talk about things. I was a big comic book collector, as was my brother. So that was a love of mine growing up. And I also, I was a library rat. I went to the library pretty much every weekend, every few days, loaded up with stuff. I grew up in Richmond, Virginia in the 60s and 70s, never had a chance to travel outside of that area, but I saw the world through books. And that just clicked for me, man. After that, it was like, boom. I love mysteries just because they had a puzzle piece component to them. I like figuring out puzzles. So I cut my teeth on Conan Doyle and Agatha Christie and Raymond Chandler. And those really spoke to me because not only did they have the mystery puzzle piece, they also had great characterization. And characters are the only way for a writer really to connect on a visceral level with readers. I can't do that with a plot. I can do it with characters. And that really, honed my talent for, wanting to dive deeply. You got to have the action. You have to have the twists and turns. You have to have the clues, the foreshadowing, the payoffs, but you have to connect on the human level. And all those writers managed to do it. My favorite writer, growing up at high school and college was John Irving. I read everything that John Irving had written. And he was a wrestler. I was a wrestler as well. And I got to meet him a few times, and it was quite an honor for me. And he told these really long generational tales over many years, taking on really substantive, serious questions, and he did it with great humor. I think he was sort of like the Mark Twain of his generation. Twain did the same thing. I'm also a Twain fan. I'm on the board of the Mark Twain House, for full disclosure. I've been a Twainiac for most of my life. And talk about a guy who could write about anything. Mark Twain definitely could.
Now, we understand your mother had already given you a very important notebook as a child to start writing down all the stories that were pouring out of your imagination already?
I was the kind of kid, in our neighborhood, it was my job to sort of choreograph all the action we would do, all the journeys and the battles we would have after school and during the summer. And I love telling people, here's what you're going to do, here's what you're going to say, here's how the plot's going to unfold. And I was always telling these tall tales, lunch, dinner, during the summer, after school. And my mom finally brought me a journal, a blank page book, and said, honey, all this stuff you've been talking about all these years, why don't you try writing some of it down? You love to read. Why don't you try to write your own little book? And so seriously, that was like an epiphany. And as soon as my pen touched the paper, I went full bore ahead. And I've been writing ever since. I was like 8 years old at the time. And I went back to my mom years later. I said, Mom, my God, thank you. What a gift you gave me that day. And she said, honey, I'm so glad it's worked out for you. But quite frankly, I just wanted to shut you the hell up, because you'd gotten my last nerve, boy, and even moms need a little peace and quiet. It was true. I did talk a lot, and I talked so much that people started calling me the Austin Avenue lawyer, because that's the street I grew up in, Richmond. Sure enough, I grew up to be a lawyer, a trial lawyer, where all I did was really talk a lot. But yes, I guess she had her crystal ball. She could see into the future.
Do you still have that notebook? I
have all the notebooks that I wrote in when I was a kid and growing up in high school, college, law school, and post-law school. Those were important. Those were very private little jewels of mine that I would keep. And I go back every once in a while and look and see some of the stuff there, see how much that was bad, much that had a little bit of promise to it, and some things that kept me going. It's very frustrating when you're writing in anonymity, nobody knows who you are, nobody's buying any of your stuff. You don't feel like there's any in game to it at all. You're just writing stuff. So to go back and sort of look over that journey again, I don't think I would have done it any other way. I'm not sure there's a perfect way to do it. You just sit down and you write, and it's a craft. You get better at it the longer and the more that you do it. And everybody goes through this gauntlet of rejections and frustration and disappointment. It's just nature of the beast.
Now, you would cut your teeth telling stories in front of juries, being a trial lawyer for nearly a decade before you became a best-selling author. Reflecting back on those years and even earlier to when you were first earning your BA in political science from Virginia Commonwealth University and then your JD from UVA's famed law school, instead of writing law journal articles, were you working on your own original stories? And how do you feel representing so many characters and being a real study of people, reading and speaking before juries, aided you in your novel writing career to follow?
I had, when I was in law school, my classmates were doing the smart thing. They were trying out for law review and moot court competitions. And I was back in my apartment in Charlottesville writing short stories and trying to sell them to Story Magazine, Atlantic, Playboy Magazine, which were, published a lot of great short fiction back then. That was my creative outlet. You're right about, legal writing can be very stilted and very mechanical. You can lose that creative spark, although, in the practice of law, it was very different. You had to be very creative. I had the same trial record as the other side. I just had to argue a completely different argument that would best represent my client. The way they did that, I would tell a story. And I would take the facts that best represented what I wanted to say and prove and present it to them in the best way. Whenever I appeared before a jury, I didn't want to overcomplicate things. I always said, keep it simple, stupid. Give them one hook. Don't give them 5 hooks to hang their head on. Give them one hook and then bear down on that hook with everything you've got. And at the end of the day, you're going to do okay.
Rolling Stone magazine thought that master burglar Luther Whitney was such a cool cat from name down that they argued Absolute Power was like a suspenseful novel that plays like a movie in your head, while the Washingtonian spotlighted the brilliance within the plot itself, wherein what became something of a signature for you to follow. A David Baldacci thriller starts with a what if. What if the thief is burglarizing a Washington mansion and accidentally sees a murder? A jewel thief who's the unwilling witness to a crime involving the President of the United States. When did Luther Whitney first break and enter into your imagination? And had you already come up with the plot by then before this renegade protagonist stole the show?
So I was a history buff. I loved history, and I had read about, Camelot with Kennedy and all the trysts. And so I started thinking about, well, the president, a lot of careers are tied to the president. So if he goes down, a lot of people are going to go down. So the stakes are high. And what would people do? How far would they go to make sure that that man never failed? So I came up with an idea. Okay, I'm going to put into a tryst and something really bad is going to happen. How is that going to work? And I thought of, well, if I'm going to make the president and everybody around him have really low morals, let me have somebody with really high morals. Wouldn't it be really cool to have a criminal with high morals? So voila, there was Luther Whitney. And I thought, I'm going to take this guy. He's going to be a career criminal. He's never hurt anybody. He plans his crimes out meticulously. Nobody's there. He goes in, gets his stuff, gets out, and that's what he does. It's a business for him. He's not this violent thief. And of course, things go awry. And it was really important for me because at the outset, this is my first novel, and I've got to make sure I've got it right. And you also have to get it right by how are the readers going to look at this character and accept them, because he's going to carry the action and the moral imperative for half a novel. He's a criminal. He steals from people. So how do I have readers rooting for this guy? Well, I did it a couple of ways. One, he only stole from really rich people. They've got insurance. Who cares, right? Secondly, I put him into this locker room where he could see out and see this president brutalizing this woman. So all the readers were on his shoulder, looking out, watching this happen, and they were having the same reaction he did. He was horrified. He was repulsed. He wanted to go out and help the woman if he could. He was having the same reaction all the readers did. Boom, there's the bond. Luther Whitney, despite the fact that he steals from people, this guy's a good guy. He's like me. I'm going to hang with him for as long as he's in this book. So those two, issues sort of sit down pat, and I sort of just sculpt his backstory, sculpt his, the story going forward with him, and then put him through his paces in the novel. I got to know Luther Whitney really well as we were going forward to dig into his psyche and understand what he would do and what he wouldn't do, how far he would go and how far he wouldn't go, and where were weak spots. So the pacing for me was critical. I wanted to write a book where I didn't want to write any pieces where I knew people were just going to skip over it. It was just too much useless information. I call it writer's bragging, humble brag, where they've done a lot of research, they pop it in there because they have to, because they worked on it and they're not going to waste that, So I tried to leave all of that out. My process was I always wanted the characters to be moving forward. I never wanted them to be sitting idle in neutral in the parking lot, and then I send them off in drive or send them in reverse. I always wanted the action going forward. In some ways, it's sort of like a film. You get, 2 hours to make your point. Every scene has to have two reasons to be in there, not just one. You have to know how you're going to get in and how you're going to get out. So I cut a lot of the extraneous material that I knew the readers didn't need, weren't going to read, were going to skip over and not enjoy. And when I got down to the bare bones of it, the pace was really, really quick. And that's how I try to, do most of my books these days. Not to say the skimp on characterization. I always go back to Abraham Lincoln's example. Two examples. One, he would write condolence letters to all mothers who lost sons in the Civil War to the extent that he could. I mean, there were hundreds of thousands. He couldn't write them all. His most famous one, he wrote a letter to a woman who had lost all 5 of her sons in the Civil War. And he started off by saying, Madam, I apologize for the length of this letter. If I'd had more time to write it, it would have been far shorter and more powerful. The Gettysburg Address, which is the most powerful political speech ever written in this country, is 363 words long. It took Lincoln 2.5 minutes to say it at Gettysburg. It is the most powerful political speech I've ever seen. So for me, it's always, if I could write it in 100 words, it'd be far better if I can do it in 10.
The New York Times would write that David Baldacci brings an insider savvy to his tale. What did you draw on that spirit from your years representing clients as a defense attorney that made it into the composites of the various nefarious characters chasing Whitney throughout the novel?
I did a little bit of criminal work. I did mostly civil work. Some of my clients have probably were criminals, but my job wasn't to represent them in a criminal case. But the machinations are still all there. The levers are still all there. Everything you're going to do, you're going to write your briefs, you're going to make your arguments to the jury or the judge. You're going to be in and out of court all the time, and you're going to have this psychological battle with yourself and your clients and everybody else involved in the case. I learned a lot, and probably the biggest thing I learned is everybody lies to you. Everybody lies to the lawyer, including your own clients. Just expect it; it's going to happen. So don't be surprised by it. You have to work around it and make sure that at the end of the day, nothing is going to come around that's going to upset the plan you have in place. And I would say the same with writing. The thing is, things are going to happen along the way. You may have this really neat outline you work really hard on, everything's perfect in the outline, and you start to write the book and everything goes off the rails. And then what do? The key thing for a writer is you have to be eminently flexible and have latitude and make sure you're going to have a bad day. What you had in the outline is not working. Change it. Think of something else. Be creative on the spot. You can do this. Don't adhere to a bad outline. It's going to turn into a bad book. I like juggling lots of balls in the air. One, it's great for your creative juices. It forces you to be creative. How are you going to do this in a plausible way? I have some, plausibility. If it could happen, I can write about it. Necessarily, it doesn't had to have happened. I love the juggling the balls. I did as a lawyer too. I would have many facets to a case. I had to worry about them all because you never know which one was going to be important. In a book, you never know which one is really going to draw a reader in, which was going to be important. I write books where I don't know the ending. Why? Because I know that the bare bolts of the book have to be in there regardless of what's going to happen. But if I can build a foundation and allow myself flexibility after I've been in the moment, in the trenches, in this story for months and months and months, and I know it better than I'm ever going to know it my whole life, that's the time where I should be selecting what's really going to happen at the end. Who really is going to be behind this? Because I'm going to know the perfect person, not months before I sit down to write the first page and I put it in an outline. Joe is the bad guy. Okay, well, I could get 375 pages into the novel. It's like, there's no way Joe is going to be a good bad guy. I mean, it's just not working. So that's why I say flexibility is really, really good. Having multiple balls in the air gives you flexibility, latitude, and ultimately choices.
You rode into the mainstream on the wave of Absolute Power's wild success, and Cosmopolitan magazine would be equally blown away by Total Control. Was that a conscious decision to write from a female protagonist's point of view with your next book starring Sydney Archer?
It was. We talked a little bit about this early on. If you want to have a long career in writing, you better be able to reinvent yourself on multiple levels. Challenge yourself, get out of your comfort zone, write about things you've never written about before from points of view you've never personally had. That forces you to be creative. That forces you to think beyond where you think you can go. The old adage is that the body will never go where the mind has never been. But if the mind has been there, the body will follow. And I've followed that adage my whole writing career. That's why I create so many different series, male, female, different people of different races, people of different backgrounds, different geographic locations. It's all to make sure that I stay fresh, invigorated, and passionate and interested in what I'm writing about. Some writers spend a whole career writing about one character, and God bless them, they do it well, fantastic. I just don't see myself doing that. I really need to have a lot of different things going on.
Now, your prolific nature as an author would reveal itself pretty quickly in the run of standalone bestsellers that followed throughout the rest of the 1990s and into the early 2000s, with The Winner, where the New York Daily News applauded you for hitting the jackpot again, pushing the pace pedal to the floor and taking the turns on two wheels. The Simple Truth, Saving Faith, which inspired USA Today to promise readers that there was plenty of action, beginning with the book's opening with a bang. Wish You Well, where Publishers Weekly observed that what the novel offers above all else is deep-boned emotional truth. Its myriad characters, each as real as readers' own kin, grapple not just with issues of life and death, but with the sufferings and joys of daily existence, in a setting detailed with the finely attuned attention and warm sense of wonder. This novel has huge heart. And Last Man Standing. Do you have a favorite character from this bunch whose story you found most thrilling or touching to tell on the page?
Probably a book I wrote called Last Man Standing. The protagonist was Webb London. He's part of the FBI hostage rescue team. I'd never really written a character like him before, who was part of this illegal organization. And I spent a lot of time with FBI agents, a lot of time with people on the HRT team to get into their hearts and souls about why they did what they did, how much they trained and how much they sacrificed on a personal level, away all the time during dangerous stuff. But to get it so that, the hardware is fun. Tom Clancy did it better than anybody, the guns and all the equipment and everything. That's great to write about, but it's no point to it unless you can get into what makes that person tick. And I'd never gotten to the head of someone like Webb London before. Part of this elite team, he goes around a corner, they're ambushed, everybody dies except him. And of course, he has tremendous survivor's guilt. And then people also are thinking, well, did you just set your whole team up? Are you a bad guy on top of being a survivor? And what could be more devastating for a guy who's trained his whole life to be this part of this elite team than all of a sudden have that ripped away from him? I'd never really done that before. And I think that was probably the book where I decided, okay, you are going to have to keep challenging yourself and get up out of your chair and go see stuff and experience stuff and talk to people, because that's where your energy comes from. That's why you sit in front of this computer 10 hours a day writing. And there's no other reason other than the fact that you're really motivated because you're interested in the material. I always tell aspiring writers, please don't chase trends. When Jurassic Park came out, every book proposal, every script proposal had a dinosaur in it. The Da Vinci Code came out, everybody's writing code books. But they weren't good books, so they weren't really interested in either of those subjects. They were just trying to chase a trend and get the easy paycheck. You've got to be motivated. Writing is hard as hell. If you're not motivated, if your creative tank is not filled up, if you're not passionate about what you're writing about, guaranteed you're going to write bad stuff, and you're going to run out of gas after like 50 pages.
Two fallen Secret Service agents who rise together in the Sean King and Michelle Maxwell series, who readers first meet in Split Second, where People magazine promised the action is explosive and readers will barely have time to catch their breath. And the Washington Post book world found that the series from Volume 1 on keeps a reader turning pages, as they did with hit sequels like The Hour Game. The Sixth Man, which the Chicago Sun-Times cheered on as an entertaining read, and King and Maxwell, where longtime fan the AP spotlighted as the best book yet in the series. What was most fun for you, novel in and out, about going on the investigative hunt with these two, as you excelled in each story with what the Associated Press recognized as a gift for just when the storyline might seem like it's going to veer into familiar areas, steering it into another shocking direction?
I liked having two protagonists, different genders, who had been part of an elite organization and then both had lost their careers over screw-ups. So they were failures professionally in their mind, and they had to come together to see if they could salvage what was left of their lives and move forward in a professional way. I'd never done that before either. And that really motivated me because I know a lot of agents in a lot of agencies, and I know how hard it is, particularly for women, to survive in what is typically still very much a man's world. So I like the idea that Michelle Maxwell was sort of like the kick-ass person, and Sean King was more cerebral, a tad slower in every regard physically. But together, they came together as a team, and they were more together than they would have been individually. And I like that concept too. I like it when people are going through tough times, they reach out to other people going through those same experiences and they survive together. That's a very cool concept for me. Split Second was the very first book I'd written where I decided that I was going to do a series. and I brought them back. They were my very first series, and I brought them back in the Hour Game and several books after that. So that was for me very much a huge step forward in my career as a writer, because writing a series is very different. But writing standalones is like it's a 2-hour movie. You're one and done. Writing a series is like a television series. You have episode after episode after episode. And you have to hold stuff back for future books. You have to keep evolving the character, which you don't have to worry about in the one and dones. So that was challenging for me and fun, and really started me off from running all these different series. That was King of Maxwell. That's where it started.
Well, give credit where it's due. Now, the Camel Club was another super cool gang that readers meet up with on the page. Introduced first to former CIA assassin John Carr, aka Oliver Stone, Vietnam vet Reuben Rhodes, book expert Caleb Shaw, and numbers genius Milton Farb and their extended group of counterparts and Secret Service agent Alex Ford, homeless activist Adelphia, con artist extraordinaire Annabelle Conroy, where your hometown paper, the Richmond Times-Dispatch, raved from the self-titled debut forward that your newest series features all of Baldacci's trademark plot twists and cat and mouse chases, as well as superbly tense grand finale. A consistent thrill fans found over another run of best-selling sequels in The Collectors, Stone Cold, Divine Justice, and Hell's Corner. What was the most wild part of the ride you went on with this merry band of power crime solvers, a company of colorful characters in both personality and skill that it sounds like gave your imagination plenty to work with, book in and out?
So when I worked in DC as a lawyer, my office was near the White House, and I would walk past the White House most days. Pennsylvania Avenue was open to traffic back then. And I liked the fact that I call them permanent White House protesters in Lafayette Park. And there was one woman there who had been there for 25 years, and she was protesting nuclear weapons proliferation. She had her little tent and the signs and the pamphlets and stuff. There was a big sign stretched between two trees in Lafayette Park, and it said, have a nice doomsday. So that was great for a guy who just moved up from Richmond, Virginia. I was like, should I go back home or what? And then I thought about, okay, I'm looking at this little woman who'd been here all this time. And I thought, what if I make her a guy who had been part of an elite organization for the US government, where he was really, he killed people that were enemies of this country. He had run afoul of the powers that be, and now I've been in hiding. And now here he was as a permanent White House protester. And I thought, okay, that could make a cool story, because there's a lot of things I can go moving forward with him, his backstory and moving forward. Then I was like, with this guy, he's an older guy, would he, over the years, he would have made friends. He would have had friendships, relationships. Then all of a sudden, the other people started coming forward, Caleb from the Library of Congress, Reuben with his military background, and also a friend, a Secret Service agent who they all knew and respected. And I thought, this is an ensemble cast. And I'd never really done that before, where you had multiple people part of this club. And that's where the idea of the Camel Club came from. It was a club of older guys who were sort of conspiracy theorists, always saw weird things happening in the real world and wanted to try to do something about it. And off I went, writing about this. And the camaraderie between them, again, these were not 20-somethings, these were 50 and 60-somethings. And some were from backgrounds that, dovetail very nicely with having sort of violence happen. Some, like Caleb, Library of Congress, probably the worst damage he'd ever had was getting a paper cut on one of the rare books in the Library of Congress. So it was a very different experience for him hanging out with these guys. But I like bringing different people from different backgrounds together and see what they're going to do. They all have different personas and different voices in my head. My wife too, when she read the Camel Club, she had her favorite. She didn't like Caleb. She goes, I wish you'd killed Caleb off instead of the other guy. I was like, well, I'm sorry. I like Caleb, I guess, more than you did. But like or not, when somebody has an opinion or emotion about a character, that tells me I've scored a direct hit with that person. They feel like, well, this person's real. And if they feel like the person's real, whether they like them or not, I've done my job.
Now, you've created what's fair to say is a lot of protagonists that readers love to root for, and John Puller is no exception. A combat Army Ranger and the U.S. Army's criminal investigations best among other unique qualifiers. Fans first discovered when they meet him in Zero Day, and rooted for him every adventure thereafter in the Forgotten to the Escape and No Man's Land, where Virginia Living assured his legions of fans that this fast-paced ride will leave you guessing until the last page. How much do you draw on from your actual interactions over the years with U.S. military members and the course of creating your characters? We understand that John Puller, for instance, is actually modeled in part on a real Virginia veteran.
I have. I've met a lot of soldiers from all the different service branches, talked to a lot of them, backstories. John Puller, when I was growing up in Virginia, the most decorated Marine in U.S. history was a guy named Chesty Puller. And every kid who grew up in Virginia learned about Chesty Puller. He never got the fourth star because of politics, Eisenhower, and he did not get along. Chesty Puller was like 72 and he volunteered to fight in Vietnam when he was 72. That's how driven this guy was. And they didn't let him go, obviously. So I like the name Puller, and that's where the name Puller came from, Chesty Puller. And then the character of John Puller's senior, Puller's dad, sort of came from Chesty Puller, a guy who had given his whole life to the service, and had come out of it battered but still standing. So at the same time that I wanted to have this military character and go off and do these investigations, I didn't want him to be like the sole warrior, because we have people like that. We have Jack Reachers in the world, and they do that great. I wanted this guy to have baggage in his life. I wanted him to have a family. He's got his father who has dementia. He has a brother who was in the first book, was in prison at USDB in Kansas. So he's got a lot of personal baggage, and he's still trying to fight the good fight. He's a member of CID. He likes to figure out puzzles. I think he likes to figure out puzzles because the greatest puzzles of his life were three. What happened to his mom? Why did his brother become a traitor? And his dad is dying, and there's nothing he can do about it. So he can't control that, but his cases he can control. He can investigate them, and at the end of the day, find out the truth. All of those elements made sense to me. I mean, I like the action component. He can take care of himself in the fight, although, he's not going to go into a room and knock out 12 guys. He's got to be a little craftier than that. And bad things happen to him. He gets hurt, because when you're in a fight, both people, you typically get hurt. That's more realistic. But I wanted him to be really a full character. I wanted him to have that backstory. So I spent as much time in the books on his backstories and relationships with his family as I do on some of the action scenes, because I wanted him to be really a full-fledged character, totally fleshed out, so people could see the guy bleed, see the guy who was in pain.
Speaking of characters that kick ass, A. Shaw and Katie James would certainly qualify. With ReviewingTheEvidence.com finding plenty of thrills within your latest teaming through the duology, The Whole Truth and Deliver Us from Evil. What made these two agents such a potent pair on the page when they're working together hunting down what are advertised as the world's biggest monsters?
Katie James, the name came from, is the name of a woman who used to be my British publicist at Pan Macmillan. Katie James, I've always loved the name. Can you get any more British than that? Katie James. And I had traveled widely in Europe, and so this idea for this character of Shaw really came to me. And again, I wanted to pair him with someone. So he had his fiance, terrible thing happened there. Then he had this journalist, she was down and out, she was an alcoholic, she'd really blown her whole career. And again, it's sort of like King and Maxwell. Can they come together and salvage what's left? Can they be something greater than they would be apart? Which is a recurring theme in my novels, because I think that human beings, we are social animals, even though these days, we live on these machines and, this is how we communicate. But if you really want to figure people out, you're not going to do it through a computer. You're going to do it face to face, person to person. And I think that still resonates, and I think it's still important. So Katie James and Shaw were two characters that were wounded, and they needed each other to move forward in their lives. And I always like that dynamic. It's just an endless classic way of telling a story.
So from Barry Eisler's John Rain to Charles Bronson starring as Paul Kersey in Death Wish, everybody loves a good vigilante taking care of those who think they're beyond the law. And your addition to that squad, Will Roby, is no exception. From the moment readers and those who have it coming first meet him in The Innocent, where Suspense Magazine discovered that, as usual, the book is definitely a one-day, edge-of-your-chair read with an ending that's a complete surprise and one of Baldacci's best since Absolute Power. This is one that will have suspense readers enthralled. And the thrills continued throughout sequels The Hit, The Target, The Guilty, and Endgame. What makes a hitman likable, and how much of that rests in the antagonist that you send him out to kill?
I think it's probably 50-50. He's going after bad guys who, in a good world, these people wouldn't exist, but they do, and they have to be taken care of. Secondly, I made him incredibly imperfect, no white knight, he has dents all over his armor. He's got issues, he's got problems, he's a lonely person. I think people can smell the sacrifice on the guy, knowing that this is all he does, and how sad can that be? My third tentpole to sort of hold the Will Roby world up is that he was incredibly professional and clever about how he went about his business. And you could fault the guy for a lot of reasons. You can never fault him for how he went in to do a job and how he got out of it at the same time. And he was also really brave. 99 things could go wrong. His job was to make sure they never did. But he always knew going to a job, no matter how perfect he had done it, there was always the unknown factor. Something is off by a millisecond, he's dead. I think people appreciate that level of courage, and that level of cunning and living by your wits, and that was how I held it up. Because the first question I asked myself is, are people going to root for this guy whose job it is to kill people? And I had to solve that problem, and that's how I did it. I think in the Guilty, he had a protagonist that was an unlikely one. It was not, a terrorist. It was not some billionaire businessman who, killed people all over the place to make money. It was something very personal in his life, part of his history that came back to haunt him. And I think that he can deal with antagonists at a distance who doesn't know, he has no connection to, other than going to put a bullet through their head. That's easy, that's safe, that's in his comfort zone. For him to have to go up against someone that he knew, that was part of his history, that's a tough case. That's a whole different animal.
Now, if we may say with Amos Decker, you brilliantly flipped the amnesia trope on its head, where in Memory Man, the Library Journal recognized that Baldacci excels at developing interesting three-dimensional protagonists. His fans won't be disappointed, and indeed we weren't through the rest of the series, traveling with him over The Last Mile, The Fallen, The Fix, Redemption, Walk the Wire, and Long Shadows, where book reporter measured Decker as one of the most unique and interesting characters to ever grace the pages of a thriller. Was this a case of art imitating life based on some kind of an amazing brain recovery story we hear about sometimes in the news?
Yeah, I was also fascinated by the brain. I'd read a book years ago called, I think it was called Born on a Blue Tuesday. It was a person with synesthesia. So they looked at days of the week and they saw vivid colors. And Tuesday was bright blue for them. And I was like, the brain is such an amazing beast. Neuroscientists today know about 1/1,000,000th of a percent more than scientists 100 years ago knew about the brain. It's still uncharted territory. They say the ocean, space is, we've explored space. We're getting to explore the ocean. This baby, we're not even close to knowing how it works, but it controls everything about us. So I was thinking, I've been a football fan for many years, and then all the information and evidence about CTE came out, and I think it really struck me. One year it was a Super Bowl, and they brought out in the pregame the 42 former MVPs, right? Guys that I had grown up watching, and cheering for it and all that. And they were in their 50s and 60s now, and they were either dead and didn't appear, they were crippled, they were in wheelchairs, or they were no longer with us mentally. And that really struck me. And so I thought, God, the brain is something we should not be subjecting things like forces like that to. Then I thought, well, what if I have a guy who played football and died on the field, and he was brought back, and it changed the way his brain works. Your brain rewires itself around damaged areas, accesses a part of his memory that most of us never do. It would give him incredible attributes for a detective. But again, I go back to this word, it gives him incredible baggage. You need to have baggage in series characters, because that baggage will be information and opportunities to exploit in future books to further cement and solidify the connection between the character and the readers. So here's again, when I first went on the first book tour for Memory Man, I asked the audience, how many here would like to have a perfect memory? You take a test, you remember all the information, you make 100. Everybody's like, oh yeah, that'd be great. I said, how many of you here have something in your past you'd rather forget? Everybody raised their hand. I said, yeah, that's the albatross. So this guy, all the bad stuff that's happened to him, he's never going to forget it. It's going to be as fresh today as it was 20 years ago. I thought that is an interesting character. I can give him the superpower and also make it his kryptonite at the same time. What a ride I can have with this guy. I love the fact that Decker can go into a case, see everything there on multiple levels, and see all contradictions, all conflicts, all things that don't make sense, and keep doing that layer after layer after layer, going through the entire case. And he also goes into a case and he really fixates on the things that most people gloss over. I learned as a lawyer a long time ago that it's the small details that come back to kill you. It's not the big stuff. It's not the stuff that everybody wants to talk about or read about. It's the little stuff. You're like, oh my God, how did I miss that? It just buried me. And that's what Decker thinks about. He goes in and he looks at the little stuff, because the little stuff is what leads to the big stuff. I love how through his eyes, he goes into a crime scene and breaks it down, these little details. While people over there, looking at fingerprints and stuff, he's looking at a piece of fabric sticking out of a chair. It's just because that means something to him, because it's an incongruity. It doesn't make sense. It's inexplicable. And from little things like that grow large trees. I love I love working with this guy. I really do.
For fans who have fallen in love with this character and the unique way that he investigates, can they plan on hearing from Decker again anytime soon?
No, Decker's going to be back. He's got a new partner and a new sort of take on life, and he's constantly evolving. His brain is constantly changing, which is a challenge for me, but a good challenge.
You next took readers down into the mystery that is the Grand Canyon itself, and those that FBI agent Atlee Pines is tasked to solve there, beginning in Long Road to Mercy, where Killer Nashville promised curious fans that Baldacci weaves an intricate tale full of action, adventure, and intrigue, living up to his readers' expectations and beyond. A tradition you continued while innovating with this dynamic new character through recent hits like A Minute to Midnight, Daylight, where John Puller co-starred, and Mercy. What first made her so when Atlee Pine invited you to embark with her on this crime-solving trek into the remote wilderness of the Southwest?
I went out to the Arizona with my wife and some friends. We did the Grand Canyon. I had flown over it many times. I flew over one time so close. The pilot, we were flying out to LA, and the pilot said, "I'm a great pilot, and I've gotten you to the West Coast in 4 hours from Washington, D.C. Unfortunately, LAX won't have a gate for us for 45 minutes. So I've got permission to drop down to 5,000 feet. I'm going to take you on an aerial tour of the Grand Canyon." So on a United Airlines flight, we dropped down to 5,000 and we circled Grand Canyon a few times, and everybody's like running to the windows looking out. And then to see it for real and experience it, I was like, this is like, the ultimate mystery, because no person on earth has seen every square inch of this place. It's too big. And that's when I decided, coming back from that trip, I'm going to build a character out of the Grand Canyon. I'm going to put a fabulous character in the middle of all this. And her name was Atlee Pine. And off we went. So I tell people, when they say, "Where do you get your ideas?" I say, I get up every day and I walk out the door just like you, but I'm receptive to creative opportunities. I'm always looking for things like that. I don't have my face buried into a phone. I'm looking at the world and watching the world. And I know at some point I'm going to see something, someone, something that's going to spur an inspiration in my mind, and another book comes out of it.
Always have your creative radars up, as they say. How much fun was it for you to team her and John Puller up together?
It was great. I wanted to bring him back anyway. A lot of the fans had clamored for him to come back. It was very plausible because the case he was working dealt with some military aspects. So he was working the same case from a different angle. And I love to do that. I did that with Amos Decker and Will Roby as well. And when you do that, it's like, on television, seeing some crossover series between favorite series. But I always love that stuff to see how the character could get along. So I like doing that. For me, it's like two bangs for a buck. I can bring two characters back in one book.
Would you use Aloysius Archer's journey, where readers really begin it with him when he's walking out of prison, and into what former President Bill Clinton called one of your finest books, with a great character, a great story, and a great portrait of an era, to talk about what writing in a different one from the present frees you up to do versus restricts you from doing with respect to investigative techniques, technology, and the absence of today's forensic advancements that pace one good deed, A Gambling Man, where CNN promised that with drugs, gambling, brothels, murders, and more, for historical crime fans, this one's got it all. And Dreamtown most recently, where readers follow Archer, Callahan, and Willie Dash to set off solving crimes in the 1950s.
I wanted to keep it, the opening simple, but I wanted to make it very firm in the reader's mind. I wanted to set the page and set the scene. And so I wanted them to know early on, we're not talking about contemporary times. This is a different time period. I love hard-boiled stories. Again, I go back to Raymond Chandler, Dashiell Hammett. The Lou Archer character was one of the best detectives ever created in my mind. And that was just, and again, it goes back to my love of history, because after World War II, America, they were sick of fighting. They were sick of the Depression. They were sick of sacrificing, sick of doing without. Everybody wanted to have fun. They wanted to go buy a home. They wanted to have a family. They wanted to put a gym or a Ford in the garage. They wanted to go on vacation. Everybody was moving west because that's where all the jobs were. And here you have Aloysius Archer, a veteran, fought well, screwed up when he got back home, went to prison for a while. Now he's going to go on parole. And I wanted to set the stage. It was a dry land, not much weather, not a lot of opportunity. This is his entry back into society, and this is his one shot to make it right, or else he's probably going to go back behind the walls again. And he was a loner, out of his depth in many ways, trying to figure it out, trying to get through every day the best he could. Now, I've just described 99% of humanity right there. So instantly people can relate to this guy. He's in a brand new world. Everybody has brand new worlds they're confronted with. A new job, a family, a new place to live, COVID, destroy, closing the world down. Everybody has challenges. So that's why I really wanted to set this, at the end of World War II, when the entire world was changing, the US was changing in particular at a drastic pace. I wanted to see if this guy could keep up.
So for fans eagerly awaiting their next reunion on the page with him, is Dreamtown the last we'll hear of Archer? Or can they look forward to his return in the near future?
No, he's coming back because, he's set himself up. He's the PI of his own in LA, the city where, all PIs eventually end up. And now I think he's really set to hit his prime.
Reader's Digest recently went wild when they picked up the 620 Man, illustrating how excited fans have stayed for your new works for decades now. What first started this latest saga of corporate conspiracies, corruption, and murder, which all come together in one of thriller fans' most anticipated books of the summer, where Baldacci's experience in this genre truly shines as he builds complex layers of riveting twists and turns to keep you on the edge of your seat.
Yeah, Travis Devine, he was a former Army Ranger. Now he's in the business world. He got his MBA and he's injected himself into Wall Street. He takes a 620 train in from Westchester County every day into Wall Street, where he works as an entry-level analyst at this big investment firm. And he passes by the rich enclaves coming into the town where he sees what he wants, or at least what he thinks he wants: big house, beautiful women, big cars, blah, blah, blah. So he's the ultimate outsider looking in until someone he knows is found dead at the investment firm. And all fingers point to him as being the killer. And now he's off and running. He's got to survive this. I thought his novel, the story for it, because I just been reading the Panama Papers and the Pandora Papers, and about all this dark money floating around the world, $40 trillion of it. And the journalist did a great job of answering every question except one. What are they doing with all this money? It's not buying the 7th yacht or the 12th private jet. If I had all that money, what I would do is I would further tilt the world in a way that would make me even more money and more power. And I think that's what the 620 Man was trying to do. I had the journalist who headed up both the Pandora Papers and the Panama Papers, the entire global effort, interviewed me a few weeks ago. He said, I was in bed reading the 620 Man. I fell on my ass on the floor when I saw Pandora Papers and Panama Papers, that he had read those and actually talked about them in the novel, because I'd never seen that in a novel before. So he said, I had to interview you. And so that was my inspiration for that. And the book spooled out in my head very quickly. I wrote it pretty quickly. This was not a contract book. Publisher didn't even know it. Nobody knew I was writing the book. I just finished it in like a couple of months and sent it up to my publisher. And they're like, wow, this is great. So that's, again, that you never know what's going to inspire you. And the force of what the journalist discovered was so overpowering my mind. All I did was take a fictional possibility, take an enormous amount of information, and turn it into a cool adventure of what if this was going to happen. I call it weaponization of capital, and believe me, it happens everywhere, every day.
Is the Pandora's Papers a book that fans can check out somewhere if interested?
They're journalistic accounts. You can get them online. And they talk about, they were busting a lot of people, politicians, musicians, actors, sports people, who were hiding this money all over the place, so they didn't have to pay tax on it, et cetera. Dictators looting their countries, putting, $500 million into trust funds in South Dakota, for instance, or Wyoming, opaque trust. Nobody knows, who owns it. Like $40 trillion, which is bigger than the United States national gross domestic product. That's a lot of money. And again, it was so much money that I decided I needed to write about it because, it seemed pretty important.
On a totally different page, you wrote quite a sophisticated psychological thriller in Simply Lies, where Publishers Weekly guaranteed fans that Baldacci is at his best in this standalone about an ex-cop and single mother who's drawn into a murder investigation. What about Mickey Gibson and the Pro-I organization work as examples of what keeps it fresh for you once you're sitting down and writing with your wheels turning as she works to clear her name?
What really intrigued me was, the character of Mickey Gibson and Clarice. These days, most people communicate like we're communicating now, computers, phones, whatever, very rarely face to face, even though it's coming back some, even without COVID, this is how we communicated, right? So my goal with this was to have two women from very different lives, with potentially very different futures. Both had their own baggages that they had to deal with. And initially they meet online, on phone, nothing personal, nothing face to face. And things happen at a very superficial level. But as a relationship develops more and more, it gets more personal. And at some point they meet face to face where the real change takes place. If you're going to change someone's life or opinion or whatever, you're not going to do it online. You're not going to do it behind this anonymous electronic shield. You're going to do it as a living, breathing human being, flesh to flesh. That's what I wanted the arc of the story to be, electronic communication, wall, blah, blah, blah. And finally, we get back to the way we used to do things, with a level and degree of humanity. I like what Gibson did for a living, pro-I, chasing down really rich people who aren't paying their bills. And believe me, there are lots of them out there. And then Clarice, who has no identity, she just has multiple personalities of her own creation because she's hiding behind her own wall because she doesn't want to be hurt anymore. If nobody knows who she is, they can't hurt her, or so she believes anyway. So really, it was quite the psychological drama, getting into the minds and hearts of those two women, how they connected, how they disconnected, and how they were going to be able to get through this again together. Neither one of them were going to be able to do it alone. And I like, again, that recurring theme. Coming together is a lot more than trying to go it alone, because oftentimes you're going to find out you don't have everything you need to get to the end.
As an expert, for an aspiring author, what are 3 or 4 partnership pillars that need to be there foundationally to really make the dynamic sturdy for fans to look forward to following book in and out?
You need to, have people who have something interesting in their background, either a talent or skill that they develop, a genetic gift they might have, or some interest or passion that's sort of outside the mainstream that people might want to know about but don't know a lot about, and that you're interested in as well. Because you need to bring that passion to the pages. If you don't have the passion, it's not going to be good enough for people to actually relate to. Then I think you need to figure out behind the action scenes. Action scenes are great. It's what a lot of people remember throughout books. Action scenes probably are about 15 to 20% of a novel. What are you going to do with the other 80%? Those are the small interactions. Those are the small set scenes. Those are like the Hitchcockian feel, that where you connect the characters and the threads going throughout. Those you have to build through. So how do you do that? Well, have some characters who have some needs, have some characters who have some abilities and have some assets, but have some characters who have some issues and problems I need to work through. And then you're going to be instantly connected with the reader, because we all have that stuff too in our lives. We have stuff we have to deal with every day we don't want to deal with, but we do anyway. And that baggage, again, I'll use that term, that's creative fodder for you to build out plot and subplot, not just in one book, but in future books going forward. Because people remember the idiosyncrasies. They remember that's the guy who has that thing going on. I'd like to see what's going to happen next with that, because that could really take him in a dangerous route. So that draws interest. So those are the pillars, interesting backstory, baggage, relations between different characters. Never think about one character in mind. Think about at least 2 characters and how they're going to be drawn together. It's a journey. Who are they going to meet along the way? Go reread The Hobbit. Bilbo Baggins, he's got 14 dwarfs that he's going to meet with, and you have Gandalf running this whole thing. That's a journey, but you don't do it alone. You pick up things along the way. You pick up strays along the way, and you build upon that. People like stories that have multiple characters coming together for some purpose, and they all have an interesting backstory. They all have things they have to learn. They all have things they could teach to each other. That is mimicking life. And people like to read exciting stuff in novels that they'll never experience in life. They like to read novels where they have some semblance of what they have experience about. And that's about people being together.
While we're drawing from your well of wisdom here, what's your formula for action at work on the page without it being too passive versus excessive?
You pick those moments. Never think about, I've gone 10 pages without someone dying. Let me slip in a murder. No, it's got to fit within the material in the story you've written. You can build up scenes that will explain why this action is going to happen. And then when it does happen, it can still be a twist and a shock. Oh my God, never saw that coming. But then people are going to be, after the action ends, are going to be like, now, how did that work? Why did that happen? Oh, I see. Okay, he laid the groundwork for that was going to happen. Or that was out of nowhere. That made no sense to me, which is not the answer you want. That's one thing I would say. Don't think that you have to have action every 10 pages. You don't. Just action can be many things. Action can be discovering a clue. Action can be meeting and interviewing a person. That's action. It's information that's revealed. That can be action as well. Action is not just guns and bombs going off. The second thing I would say about action, and I really mean this, when you write the action scenes, the best thing you can do is slow it all down. Slow it down. Don't blow through the action scenes. The action scenes are exciting in and of themselves. What makes it even better is when you slow it down, give the details to show what's happening, and show the effect it's having on people. If someone gets shot, show it, both the shot and the aftermath of what it does to the body. I don't mean in grisly detail, I mean emotionally. One of the best films I ever saw in my life was 1992. It was Unforgiven with Clint Eastwood. Clint Eastwood shot a guy in the belly from long range because the guy was trying to kill him. And for the rest of the night, the scene after scene after scene, we listened to and watched as this guy died from a belly wound. And Eastwood is there with him at a distance and sort of talking him through it. And I remember that scene, 30 years later, because he slowed it all down. If it's gone in the blink of an eye, that's how long the reader's going to remember it. A blink of an eye, and they're going to like, oh yeah, whatever that thing was. Yeah. Slow the action down, give it its worth. If it's important to the novel, slow it down and give it its worth. If you're, personal defense instructors will tell you when you train for this stuff to defend yourself, doing it fast is the worst thing you can do. You do it slow, over and over and over, slow, 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 and you practice, practice, practice. Because when you're ever going to have to pull this stuff out, God forbid you ever do, the adrenaline's going to be there and you're going to do it fast. You don't have to train to be fast. You have to train to be slow so you know what you're actually doing. Then the movements come to you naturally. It's muscle memory. Same thing with action scene. Slow it down.
Kind of like Luther Whitney moves in that classic opening sequence to Absolute Power where he rappels out the window of a mansion that he's just broken into and then outruns Secret Service agents trailing him. What did it feel like to hear that Dirty Harry himself was not only going to be directing, but starring in that very scene and the film version of your breakout bestseller? And how involved were you as creator with this adaptation?
I worked with Eastwood. I was on set. I worked with Bill Goldman on the script. He came down and we went through a bunch of locations in Virginia. He would call me up from time to time. And Eastwood's, I've been on a lot of film sets, all the stuff that I've had done over the years. And his was the calmest film set I've ever been on in my life. There was nothing, talk about slow. It was slow and fast. He would slow to build up and do a scene, and he would do it in one take or at most two and then move on. I've never seen that on a film set in my life. He spoke quietly. You could barely hear the guy. It was like his team knew what he was going to do or say before he did or said it. And then methodically plotted it out, got the shot. He was a director. He had to set the shot up. The shot's ready to go. He puts on his costume, gets in front of the camera, does his bit, takes the costume off, gets behind the camera, checks the shot. Okay, move on to the next one. So it was professionalism at its zenith. And I really respected that and got a lot out of being, a part of that process. Yeah, when they called and told me he was going to do it, I called like everybody I'd ever known in my whole life. It's like my first grade school teacher, Mrs. Dugan. Yeah, it's David. You're never going to believe what's happened to me. So it was pretty amazing. All the planets were in alignment. My film projects after that, none of them has been nearly as smooth as that first one. But that was a rock star cast. It was a great film. The first act of that film is one of the most compelling I've ever seen, even though it's based on my own stuff. It's just a rocket ship with heart. You get the character really quickly, and the pace is nonstop, and you come out of that first act and you're just soaked in sweat.
You would then see your imagination's creations brought to life on the TV screen with King and Maxwell on TNT. What's different for you about getting to enjoy seeing a pair of characters' arc develop over a season of episodes versus, say, how it's paced in a 2-hour film?
It totally was, in TV, I read the scripts and get some notes on those. You watch some of the dailies, and the relationship, John Tenney and Rebecca Romijn, I thought they had great chemistry. I wish that had come back for multiple seasons. There were a lot of reasons behind the scenes why it did. It was the second highest rated cable show for that year. The ratings we were averaging like 6 million people for cable. That's a pretty high score. Today it would be a landslide. But I enjoyed what they did, and I thought it had great potential moving forward if it continued season after season. I thought they were really well cast together, and they had great chemistry and really got along. But those are things beyond your control. And I tell people, when you sell film stuff, let it go, and don't. And if you ever get pissed about how they did something or didn't do something, I have a foolproof method. I keep a copy of every check they give me. So if I'm pissed, I go and look at a copy of the check. I'm like, life is good, man.
By your smile, we'll take your word for it. And we understand writing for a YA audience brings just as big as one. What's been the biggest joy within that experience of creating series for younger readers, like Freddy and the French Fries over Fries Alive and The Mystery of Silas Ficklebean, and the Vega Jane series, where Scholastic promised that this was David Baldacci as you've never seen him before, throughout The Finisher, The Keeper, The Width of the World, and The Stars Below?
Yeah, for me, I love reading fantasy growing up. I wanted to see, again, a challenge out of my comfort zone. Could I pull this off? Could I do it? Could I bring enough passion and interest to the pages, and pull off, 4 books in this series showing this evolution of her. And I also, the idea of reaching younger readers was great. Look, I know what reading meant to me growing up. It saved me in so many ways. I grew up in, the old capital of the Confederacy in Richmond, Virginia, in a heavily segregated, racist society. And a lot of people I grew up with thought that was perfectly normal and fine. And what saved me were books. I didn't travel outside of Richmond, but I traveled the world through books. And I saw people that didn't look like me, pray like me, eat like me, learn like me, speak like me, but we all share the common core of humanity. So for me, letting kids read some of my books, age appropriate level, if that instills in them a love of reading and make it part of their life for their entire lives, the world will be a much, 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 much better place.
Finally, in closing, with 150 million books sold and counting around the world, that isn't merely to mention the number, but to spotlight the way in which it reflects such a loyal global reading audience. What has it meant to you that your style of storytelling has resonated over so long with so many?
It's a wonderful feeling. And, it's one of the reasons why I think that keeps me so engaged, because I see the results of what's happening. People read books. I write for 3 reasons. One, I love to write. Secondly, I want to entertain. Third, I want to inform. I want people to enjoy stuff, and I want them to learn maybe some things that might be important for them. And they can read my book about some subject and then go read a bunch of other stuff about it if they're so interested. Because that's really what makes the world go round. We've lived with stories ever since, mankind has been around. That's how we used to handle histories down, oral histories down, generation to generation. So that's how people like to communicate. I've always looked at the verbs to read and to think as being the same. You can't do one without the other. So the more that people read, whether my books or someone else's, the better world we're going to have. But it is a wonderful feeling to know that people have read my books, over generations, and have read them year after year after year and enjoy them and get a lot out of them and keep coming back to them, and more readers come and do the same thing. That is a wonderful, wonderful thing. I never thought it would happen. I never expected it to happen, but because it has happened, I'll never take it for granted.
Mr. Baldacci, it has been a true thrill talking today. Thank you so much for taking out time to be on About the Authors TV.
Thank you. I enjoyed it very much.